I'm here with Dr. John Baker, my good friend who holds a PhD in both microbiology and immunology. And his life's work is gut health, what's referred to scientifically as microbiome. So he's going to be talking us to today about microbiome and gut health in depth.
Jake and I go back quite a while now. I think, probably between 15 and 20 years.
Yes.
So we were both at SUNY Geneseo, which hard to believe. We finished up there, about 16 years ago now.
Yep.
I had my degree from there in biology. And after that, I worked as a lab technician in a lab that was doing virus research at the University of Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry. And I did a master's part-time during those years. And then in 2012, I went back to school full-time and did a PhD in microbiology and immunology. And specifically, I was studying how the bacteria that live on your teeth cause cavities. When I finished up with that, I did an internship briefly at Pfizer in vaccine development outside of New York City. Who'd have thought if I had stuck around in that internship or job for till 2020, that would have gotten a lot more exciting.
Yeah, crazy.
At that time, my dream was always to be faculty at a medical or dental school and open my own research lab. And the career path to do that, you usually need to do what's called a postdoctoral fellowship, which is typically 3 to 6 years of additional work past the PhD.
Okay.
And that took me to several places. I was at doing research at UCLA School of Dentistry, at a private nonprofit in San Diego called the J. Craig Venter Institute, as well as the UC San Diego School of Medicine. And I continued to study how the bacteria that live in the mouth and elsewhere in the body affect our health. And then just about a year ago, I moved to Portland, Oregon, where I've now got a tenure track faculty position and opened my own research lab at Oregon Health and Science University, which serves as the medical, pharmacy, and dental schools for the University of Oregon system and the state of Oregon overall.
You and I always resonated in college, and I always enjoyed doing it personally. And so I followed you, but then just after asking you to come on and do this interview, I started following John Baker Labs. And dude, it was just so awesome to see all the studies that you're involved in publishing, to see you doing research in the lab. I knew you were doing this stuff, but to actually be able to follow and see it, your dream has really come true. It's incredible to see, John.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been a long road. But yeah, it's really cool to finally see things start to come together.
So my first question for you, because John, unfortunately, I'm an influencer. I'm part of the problem in the world these days. Is this topic way more complex than Instagram would have you believe? Do we really have an understanding of gut health yet?
Absolutely, it's very complicated, and definitely we're still figuring things out. I think it's important to sort of make a distinction here that when you talk about the microbiome, people use the word just microbiome.
Yes.
Typically, a lot of times they mean the gut microbiome, but different sites on and in your body each have their own microbiome, and they're all very complex. You can imagine, any microbiome is sort of like an entire ecosystem or food web. And just like an ecosystem of plants and animals in a rainforest or a desert, each site in your body, right? The rainforest and a desert have very different plants and animals, but just like that, the microbiome of microbes that lives on your skin, in your mouth, in your urogenital tract, different areas of your digestive tract. Each one is a different environment with different microbes living. And those can change over time based on things like your diet and your immune system, or even on a smaller scale, just within the mouth, for example, right? There's different ecosystems on your teeth versus your tongue versus your gums.
Wow.
Adult humans have around 30 trillion cells in their body. And typically, just to give you an idea of how many bacteria live within us, for every human cell, there's at least one bacterial cell living on and inside of you. And there's hundreds of different species. And the microbiome is actually not just bacteria, but it's also made up of other things like microscopic fungi and viruses. And those are all completely normal and in healthy people. And just as there's viruses that infect and hurt us, there's viruses that infect and kill bacteria called phage. And so you could imagine that these, the presence of different phages can impact the bacteria in the microbiome, and then in turn affect how the microbiome impacts your health. there's all these different layers essentially. So it's incredibly complex.
I've even heard talk about like the difference between having birth through vaginal canal versus C-section can affect microbiome. So when people talk about microbiome, it's a much more complex and broad scale than we think about it on.
Right. And a lot of times, and I'm guilty of this as well, is just, in simple conversation, when people say microbiome, a lot of times they just mean the gut. But I think it's an important distinction to make that all these different body sites each have their own microbiome that affects your health in different ways. And even, for example, different species of bacteria can be good or bad in different microbiomes. For example, there's a whole genus of bacteria called lactobacilli that in the mouth, they actually can be considered bad because they're very good at producing acid, which can cause cavities on your teeth. But for example, in the digestive tract or the vagina, they're actually associated with health. And like in the vagina in particular, they actually produce this acid and it keeps the environment acidic that actually prevents other things like yeast from growing. So the same bacteria can be good or bad depending on where you have it and how abundant it is.
So even within gender, there's different microbiome. Like a male probably through their urinary tract has a specific form of microbiome, and the female through the vaginal canal has a specific form of microbiome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me ask you kind of a broad topic, and I know this is super broad then. What are some common myths that you see perpetuated about microbiome?
I think just anything that's sort of simplistic, and I would say to me, a lot of the myths, they're sort of inaccuracies that I get struck with most frequently are a lot of sort of the grandiose claims made by a lot of microbiome startup companies and probiotics companies. Outside of my academic career and experience, I also do have some experience doing private consulting for microbiome companies. And just coming from an academic background where everything is peer reviewed and, has to be very, very solid to get published, it blew my mind going to like a conference that's more focused on startup companies and the type of data that they show. And, they'll be advertising products and the data to back the product up. Like it would never fly in like a reputable peer reviewed journal.
I mean, marketing, anytime people can make money off stuff, they need to dumb it down to some extent, but at the same time, they just make it so simplistic because they're just trying to drive revenue.
Right. And it's important to remember that these startup companies, they don't have to convince like the world's leading experts on a topic. They just have to convince investors. And a lot of times these investors don't even have a background, any sort of background knowledge about the topic. And also, probiotics are typically classified as supplements, right? They're not a drug or a treatment, they're a supplement, which is, I think, most of your audience is familiar with how little evidence is required to market a supplement and make claims about it that aren't necessarily backed up.
Yeah, so the FDA in the United States of America, for anyone who doesn't know, if you have a supplement and you make a claim, the FDA has to actually prove that your claim is incorrect, and they actually have to prove that your supplement is harmful, which is grossly different than how we treat food or drugs. Food or drugs need scientific literature and backing to prove the claims that they're making, and they actually have to prove that it's safe before it's released to the public. So it's completely different. And that's why you can see bold claims from supplements saying this will grow your penis, or supplements will claim like this will let you gain 8 pounds of muscle in 3 days. I'm being hyperbolic, but they make these crazy claims because it's kind of like, ha, catch me if you can. Is there actual scientific evidence behind probiotic supplements? Is there any benefit to these things?
Yes, there is, but it's very dependent. I think we'll put a link in this video, but there's a resource from the NIH that actually has a list. It gives a really nice background on the actual different conditions where we know that probiotics actually have a good benefit. So an important thing to actually start with is there's no body of experts, like the American Medical Association or NIH or anything like that. For a healthy person, probiotics aren't really recommended. They don't have anything to say officially for or against them for a healthy person. Okay. However, there are a number of conditions where there have been peer-reviewed studies, and in some cases even clinical trials showing that very specific probiotics work. But then it's important to consider that if you want to get the benefits that maybe were shown in a study, you have to use that exact strain of probiotic and that exact amount. And it gets very hard to test these things. Human beings are very diverse. We have diverse habits. We all have different diets, different hygiene, different exercise, sleep schedules, all those things. And those can all impact your microbiome, and then how probiotics would impact your microbiome or whatever condition that you're trying to treat.
What are some conditions that are common, or at least relatively common, that probiotics would be suggested for, John?
On the NIH's list are atopic dermatitis, diarrhea caused by use of antibiotics.
Okay.
All right, so that's a very common scenario, right?
Yep.
Especially in older folks where you have they have an infection and they take systemic antibiotics that essentially destroy their whole microbiome, and then they have something like Clostridium difficile, or C. diff for short, which is pathogenic and causes a lot of problems, and it's very difficult to treat. And normally, when you have a healthy microbiome in place, it's never going to sort of take over and get to the numbers that would cause disease. But if you essentially nuke everything with antibiotics, then you're more susceptible to that. So that's one of the main conditions where probiotics have really shown to be helpful, is after antibiotic treatment. Okay. Inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, high cholesterol, and obesity are the other things that round off.
So probiotics can be helpful if you have cholesterol, high cholesterol.
Correct. Yeah. And so on the NIH site that we'll link, that it has a link to like the peer-reviewed evidence and the studies that actually explain what they found. But it was a high enough level of evidence that the NIH has decided to put that on their list on their website.
So you have a catchphrase: discover how the bacteria that lives in us impacts our health. Tell me what that means to you.
As we mentioned earlier, there's a lot we don't know. We do know, that the microbiome impacts how we digest our food. It impacts our metabolism. It protects us from bad or pathogenic bacteria from taking over. And then we're even learning, as we may touch on a little bit more depth in a minute, we know that there's the gut, the bacteria influences the gut, and there's what's called the gut-brain axis. And so the microbiome can sort of actually influence things that go on in the nervous system and the brain, as well as, we're learning that it's also associated with a lot of other, conditions, cardiovascular disease, obesity, even things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's can be influenced by the microbiome. And we kind of know that these correlations exist, but we're still kind of unsure about how that's happening. With that knowledge, then knowing what would be how to develop a new therapy or preventative treatment.
And do you think that probiotics can be part of the cure to obesity? Do you think that that has a role in it?
I think that it definitely can have a role. So another sort of limitation about our current knowledge, right? A lot of these things are correlations, and they kind of become a chicken or egg question, right? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? And it's, is my metabolism messed up and I'm obese because my gut microbiome is unbalanced? Or am I obese and my metabolism is messed up, so in turn that's making my gut microbiome unbalanced? And those aren't mutually exclusive. So it's likely sort of a combination of the two, but because it's not, a simple answer, it makes sort of figuring out how those relationships work, what the best way might be to design treatments, whether that's a probiotic or some sort of more targeted antibiotic or something like that. It makes it very difficult to sort of elucidate all those things and figure out, the best way forward. But we are making progress.
So the question I'm going to ask you may be very complex, but what I'm looking for is simple actionables. What are some things that people can do to improve gut health?
I think a lot of it gets back to holistic health. So as we just mentioned, right, it's all connected. And sort of the relationship and communication between your health and the microbiome goes both ways. How you live your life will impact your microbiome. Eating a balanced diet with lots of whole, minimally processed foods, exercising regularly, prioritizing your physical and mental health, minimizing refined sugars in particular is important for the microbiome. In terms of the oral microbiome, brushing your teeth, flossing, getting regular dental cleanings. There's all kind of links that we're discovering now between oral health and systemic health. And although, as we mentioned, certain probiotics, you have to analyze the level of evidence for any type of probiotic on an individual basis. And I would say there's a lot of individual probiotics I might be skeptical of, but as we mentioned, there are some that definitely do work for certain conditions, or there's a high level of evidence. And so I would say if you have some of those conditions, I would definitely consider those probiotics.
Yeah. You kind of touched on refined sugar, so I'd love to hear, how does refined sugar have an impact on gut health? Because I'll be honest with you, I don't really talk about it a lot on Instagram because it's kind of like a heavily fortified area. When you look at calories, when sugar is equated, they don't have much of an impact on health. And to some degree, people don't understand this, but like glucose, fructose, sucrose, all these things, your body needs sugar to survive. But refined sugar in particular, how does that impact microbiome? Because you're saying here, particularly in the mouth, that it's detrimental. Does sugar need to be eliminated, which is the extreme side, or does it just need to be reduced? And what impact does it have on microbiome?
Refined sugar in particular is more bad for the oral microbiome than the gut. And so the problem with refined sugar is there's specific types of bacteria, which is actually the bacteria that I've spent the most time of my career studying, called Streptococcus mutans. When you give it refined sugar, it makes this really sticky coating around all the bacterial cells, and it makes this really thick biofilm on the surface of your teeth. And so the other problem is all these bacteria that live in that basically essentially makes the dental plaque a lot worse. And so the problem is that when you have this thick biofilm against the surface of your tooth, all these bacteria, the end product of their metabolism is acid. And so when you have this thick biofilm, you have all these bacteria making acid, and they're stuck to the side of your teeth, and that acid doesn't have anywhere to go. Like, it can't diffuse out into the saliva easily. And so you actually the acid will get to the point where it melts a hole in your tooth, and that's what a cavity is. And so if you don't have the refined sugar, other sugars, like for example, fructose, which is the main sugar in fruits, it doesn't have nearly the same impact of making these really sticky, thick biofilms of strep mutans on your teeth.
There might actually be something to not having sugar before you go to bed.
Oh, 100%. So that's a whole nother piece of it is, your mouth is naturally basic, and, over time you're going to neutralize that acid. But if you're that's why drinking soda or soft drinks all the time is one of the worst things you can do, because if you were to sort of graph like the pH or acidity in your mouth over time, it goes up and down, and it gets really acidic after you eat. And so, but if you're constantly drinking sugar, you don't have any time for your mouth to recover, and your teeth will actually start to remineralize. There's calcium in your saliva, and your teeth have the ability to sort of heal themselves to some extent. But if you don't ever give them that time to recover, if you're snacking on sugar too frequently, whether that's, sugary snacks or soda with a lot of sugar in it, you're not giving your oral microbiome and your teeth really a chance to sort of reset. And so then the damage can become irreversible. And that's when you have, a cavity where you have to get a filling or you have to get a tooth pulled. And other types of sugars aren't nearly as bad as sort of the refined sugars that we eat in a lot of processed foods now. As you said, you're absolutely correct in that we do need sugar to live. We need, especially if you're exercising or, you're playing a sport or you're doing something, you're going to need some simple carbohydrates and quick energy sources. But it's just, you want to sort of limit that, especially those of a refined nature.
So I'm going to ask you the opposite question, because people constantly talk about soda versus diet soda. And I've always said diet soda is the better option of the two. Is artificial sweetener terrible for microbiome? Do we actually know that has an adverse effect in human beings? Not rodents, none of those studies, but actual human beings. Do we know that?
In human beings, I would say that on a very general level, the data is mixed, and we don't really have a great idea. I think my personal recommendation or philosophy would sort of be, if you have a real sweet tooth, right, and this is going to help you lose weight or get to a healthy weight by having some snacks or some drinks that have an artificial sweetener, I think that sort of the benefits outweigh the possible risks, right? I think the good can outweigh the potential bad. I mean, I would say if you're somebody that doesn't have a huge sweet tooth or you're at a healthy weight already, and you could avoid a lot of refined sugars and artificial sweeteners, that would obviously be ideal. But of course, we need to be realistic. So I think it's just sort of a balance. But you're completely right in that a lot of the data about artificial sweeteners and linking them to bad effects on the microbiome and cancers and things like that, a lot of times they're in animal studies, and those don't always translate to humans.
So if I'm hearing you right, and I'm not trying to pigeonhole you here, John, but refined sugar, definitely bad. Artificial sweeteners, jury's still out, but if you can avoid it or at least reduce it, you probably should.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And again, I do have some artificial sweeteners in my diet. Very few people I know are like complete fitness cyborgs that they can only eat single ingredient foods. Obviously, in an ideal world, that'd be better, but for most people, what ends up happening, in my experience, they adhere, and then they binge. So people will follow a diet plan, and then what will end up happening is they just break down and they can't sustain it. Talk to me about fiber, John. And there's a lot of forms of fiber. There's soluble, there's insoluble. Talk to me about the benefits that has on microbiome as a whole.
Fiber, essentially, right, it's this very broad term, and it's just it's stuff that the human digestive system alone can't digest. And so some of it does pass through you completely unchanged, but a lot of it, we can't digest it, but all the bacteria that live in your gut can. And so it sort of serves as food, or a lot of times you'll hear the term prebiotic. So a prebiotic is any type of food that's going to promote the growth of a certain bacteria. And so of course, typically we're thinking we're going to give a prebiotic or food that's going to help a good or health associated bacteria grow, as opposed to a probiotic, which is actually giving the live bacteria itself. And so if you think about it, then most fibers are actually a type of prebiotic. And so having a lot of fiber is good for your digestion, as it'll help things pass through, but it also can serve as food for bacteria in your gut that are beneficial to your health. And so, if you don't have a high fiber diet, you're probably not going to have a really healthy, diverse gut microbiome. And as you've talked about in some of your content before, right, there's all these studies, linking high fiber, having more fiber to reduction in all-cause mortality, reduction in cardiovascular disease, all these things. And some of that is probably due to the fact that you're feeding the good bacteria in your gut when you have fiber.
And we commonly refer to fiber soluble and insoluble, and even insoluble, which you're right, your body can't digest, right? There's a link to it decreasing dementia within that, Alzheimer's, and even Parkinson's. And that might be to what your point is, that actually helps feed, but even though the body can't digest it, your microbiome can feed on it.
While it's clearly beneficial in a very general sense, there are many types of fiber. We say protein, there's many different types of amino acids. Yes. We say fat, many different types of fat that have different, effects on your health and your metabolism. And so I think with fiber, a lot of it, we're still kind of we are figuring out which individual fibers are maybe good or bad. And I think as with the probiotics, the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, has some resources that talk about the level of evidence for different types of fiber, and we can also link that in the show notes.
So when you say sure to me, John, it sounds like you're humoring me. So don't pull any punches. Tell me, what am I off on when I'm saying that? So insoluble fiber probably correlated with, or at least in some research is correlated with, Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Are you saying that there's just so many different versions of fiber that it's impossible to know if that's what the microbiome's feeding on? What do you mean by that?
No, I just mean, soluble and insoluble are two very broad categories, right? It's the same in fat, right? You have saturated and unsaturated fat, but even within those, there's many different kinds.
Poly and mono,
there are
saturated
studies.
Yeah,
there are a lot of different studies looking at individual fibers. It's just important to sort of keep that in mind, that they're not all necessarily the same or going to have the same effect, right? Because we all have different microbiomes, we're also going to process fiber differently. And so that's actually one of the main results of sort of the NIH's position on fiber, I'm actually going to quote here is that they said, overall, our findings show that benefits of fiber are dependent on fiber type, dose, and participant, a landscape of factors resulting from the interactions between the fibers, the gut microbiome, and the person, right? And so it's just really dependent. And so, a type of fiber that might give somebody gas, and then another person it might not, right? I would say the best advice would be to have, in general, a lot of fiber, but have it from, diverse fruit and vegetable sources.
Great.
And, really kind of see what works with your eating habits, with your lifestyle, and, with your digestive system.
Amazing. Yeah, because I always hear people that, I remember when I was a kid, if I had broccoli, it would make me gassy. And now I eat so much damn broccoli, John, and I don't have any issue with it whatsoever. Just as, obviously that's completely anecdotal, but like clearly microbiome changes over time and your response to these foods, etc. And I do always think about that generic advice that they give people, and they say, oh, you should be eating a lot of different colors of fruits and vegetables. Okay, well that just seems like, like very generic bullshit advice. But when you start to understand like how these all have different antioxidant and fiber profiles, why there really is a benefit to get a wide variety of fruit and vegetables.
Exactly. That's spot on.
We have a lot of animal studies, including how they respond to certain foods, like we talked about with like artificial sweetener. Does this translate to human beings? Should people be citing animal studies to tell people to stay away from certain foods?
That's a tricky answer. I mean, certainly animal studies are very important, and we wouldn't be where we are with our knowledge about lots of things, health included, that without animal studies.
Yep.
Plain and simple, using a mouse as an example, a mouse isn't a human, right? And there's a lot of similarities, but we can all agree they're not the same thing. And when you're talking about the microbiome specifically, right, the microbes that naturally inhabit mice, they're similar in some ways to those that inhabit humans, but they aren't the same.
Yeah.
And beyond that, animal studies are able to control a lot of variables. So it's important to remember, for example, in most mouse studies, the mice are all genetically identical. They're essentially all identical twins of each other. They've all had the same life, had the same food, the same environment, the same stimulation. When you give them some sort of treatment, whether that's, a drug to treat a disease or a probiotic to modulate their microbiome, it may work in a specific animal model under these very specific controlled conditions. When you take all that, when you think about all that, you try to put that into humans, that as I mentioned before, we all are different genetically. We have different immune systems. Yes. We eat different things, have different habits. You can imagine that it might not work out in such a straightforward or good manner in people. And that is why a lot of animal studies don't necessarily translate to humans, but they are a very important, intermediate step in the research process. When you talk about levels of evidence, so, if I were to read a peer-reviewed study that's that some company is citing on their website to promote their probiotic, it's important to look at the level of evidence. Was this probiotic helping, or prebiotic, for example, helping bacteria grow in a test tube? Was it in a mouse model, or was it in a human clinical trial, right? I mean, and I've seen microbiome or probiotic startup companies make claims just based on what's going on in a test tube. And obviously that probably has nothing to do with that. It's not relevant at all to what might happen in a human with their own diverse microbiome.
By the way, I wasn't stating, and I know you're not saying that I was, but I wasn't stating that animal studies don't have an extremely important role in research, because they do. I just think a lot of people, companies, like you said, they extrapolate data from that and then try to translate it to, buy this food or buy this supplement or don't have seed oil or avoid artificial sweeteners. And those aren't the same thing. I think they're necessary, especially to lay a groundwork for research that you can then try to duplicate in human models. I hear people making the correlation. We talked about how the brain and microbiome have a link to each other, but I also hear people talk about microbiome and mental health and how they play a role or they correlate with each other. Is there a connection there, or is it too soon to know? Is there any validity to this about I changed my diet and it cured my depression, it got rid of my anxiety, things like this?
The example you just gave, right? That could happen. If that hypothetically did happen, it could be through the microbiome, or it could just be directly from changing your diet, right? There definitely is a connection between the microbiome and the brain and the nervous system, which of course your mental health is going to be impacted by what's going on with the chemistry in your brain. So I think that in humans, a lot of the evidence for those types of things, like, so we know in animal models, right, the microbiome can influence things like motivation for exercise.
Yeah.
It can regulate social behavior. But as we mentioned, we don't know, since that happens in mice, we don't know that it happens in humans. And so we're not there yet. I think, it's pretty amazing that it happens in mice. Like, that seems pretty incredible that bacteria living in your gut can impact something like your motivation to exercise. So I think the animal studies show that it's certainly possible.
Wow,
and maybe even likely in humans, but like, how does it work, and how might we use that knowledge to our benefit? I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, and by the way, I think you also made the good point earlier about the chicken and the egg thing. If you started exercising more often, you are less likely to be depressed. As a matter of fact, actually exercise has been shown more effective than antidepressants for taking care of depression. And part of that could simply be, hey, if you look better, or if you feel better, or if you're more mobile, you're going to be less depressed anyhow. And so it could be a cause and effect thing, that it's not directly actually curing depression or helping fight the depression, that it could be other effects like how you look or how you interact with other people. The same could be true with microbiome and it having a role. Like if you change your diet, hey, I changed my diet, I lost 10 pounds, suddenly people are more receptive when they interact with me, or I feel better about myself. Just the reality, right?
Yeah. Imagine that.
Imagine that. Those could also play an impact on you feeling depressed. And even just, for example, exercising, maybe it has an impact on your microbiome, but it's also going to have an impact on just how you feel about yourself, which is going to help with depression.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
I don't know if this is a real thing or not, but what is leaky gut?
So leaky gut's kind of a broad term that people use to describe a disruption to the normal barrier function of your digestive tract, specifically your intestine. And so if you think about it, the job of the intestine as sort of a barrier is really important, because the food that you're eating is passing through, and we have to get the nutrients through the intestine, but you don't want things like bacterial toxins, right, or the bacteria themselves to get through that barrier. And so people kind of use leaky gut as the sort of catch-all to describe a disruption to that barrier, where maybe you have bacteria passing through the intestinal wall and maybe causing inflammation. The term's been around for a while, and similar to kind of the microbiome, it kind of had its own sort of hype cycle, if you will, and there was a lot of hype around it, and we could do this or do that. But I think, in the scientific community, we've really moved away from talking about leaky gut specifically, because it's really sort of almost like a spectrum of a bunch of different sort of unrelated conditions or mechanisms that can be happening. So I would say it's not BS, because, there are conditions or times where that can happen and it can cause different diseases or conditions. But, that's such a catch-all term. It's kind of right. Similar is right. We talk about autism, right? People, it's a spectrum, right? It's kind of leaky gut or things that like that are kind of a spectrum. And so because they're all can be sort of different mechanistically, the scientific community really isn't a fan of that term or using it.
Great. So if you hear that term, it may be a red flag for what somebody's talking about it potentially, but there are certainly circumstances in which it could apply.
Yeah. And I think, that term itself, and sort of the peak of its hype cycle, which was a number of years ago, it was a lot of, homeopathic and pseudoscience type of things that were really touting, you have this symptom, you have leaky gut, and you should take our product. But, out of that didn't ever really go anywhere.
By the way, that's usually the other red flag, is like, first of all, some sort of crazy buzzword, and by the way, pay this and we'll fix it for you. That's a pretty good red flag. What about probiotics in food? Because there's been a lot of controversy around like yogurts, for example, and the FDA talking about ones that advertise them as having probiotic health. Like, what is the role of food with probiotics, and should these foods be touted as like helping with probiotic health?
It goes back to the level of evidence. And again, like the resource that we're gonna link, we'll show you, talk about some specific examples. And again, there's yogurt can be made by different species of bacteria, and then even different strains within that. And that's why, different types of yogurt kind of taste differently from the ingredients and then the microbes that ferment the yogurt. And so any type of study right, that's going to be well controlled is going to be looking at a specific yogurt. And so the effect of one yogurt might not be the same as another. And again, it might not be the same in one person versus another person. One of the things to keep in mind is that a lot of these fermented foods that, can be sometimes touted as probiotics,
Kimchi,
or a lot of times they're
sauerkraut,
treated after the fermentation and it kills all the microbes, so they're no longer probiotics. So like a very simple example would be sourdough bread, right? You could hear people, sometimes you'll hear people say like, oh, like sourdough bread has probiotics in it. Well, you literally bake the bread, which kills all the bacteria in it. So it's not a probiotic by definition, right? Probiotic has to be live. And the other component is when people talk about them, they're usually meaning probiotics for your gut microbiome. And to get to your intestines, you have to pass through the mouth and then the stomach. And the stomach's incredibly acidic, which is how it digests our food. But that'll also kill a lot of the microbes or probiotic organisms that are in the food. And so, it can be rare for things to pass through. And that's one of the real problems with designing probiotics, because there is a lot of good, legitimate science making efforts to design good probiotics, but that's one of the big challenges is delivery to the right place, like in a dose that's effective, because you're going through the stomach, which is, it's acidic enough to digest all of our food, right? So it kills most of the bacteria.
Dude, this is so interesting. I mean, the number one thing I learned here is that I don't know as much as I thought I did, and I even am a person who's always like, I don't know as much as I think I do. When people talk to me about microbiome, my response is usually like, I think we're like, 10, 20 years from understanding this, and like, I'm not the person to talk to about it. From having this conversation, I just even more realized I'm not the person to talk to about this subject. Just this concept of you looking at something that says probiotics on it, and you feel good about yourself because you're like, oh, this will have an impact, and the reality is like, yeah, it really is very like specific to whatever's going else in your body, like what's particularly going on with you. Like, do you have high cholesterol? Do you have obesity? Do you have a condition? Like, do you have diarrhea? Like, there's a specific probiotic specifically for what you're dealing with. And the other really interesting thing I found was that you said that the recommendation for healthy people is they don't actually need probiotics or to actively seek out probiotics in their diet.
Certainly probiotics might be beneficial, and they're not, it's not like they would be bad for healthy people. I would say in a healthy person, like the evidence that they're going to do something good to make you even more healthy is somewhat limited, which is why, they don't take a position saying a healthy person should have more probiotics.
Look, here's the truth, is that when you go up to something and it says probiotic on it, you're like, oh, okay, this is gonna make me better. Like, you have almost this feeling like you're doing something good for yourself as you walk out the grocery store with it in your grocery cart. And the reality is it's far more complex than that.
Sure, yeah, and I'm guilty of that. I needed to stop and get something to drink, and I kombucha. And then I looked at, and I was looking at what was in it, and I was like, oh, 12 grams of added sugar. Great. Probably won't be getting this one again.
The other classic example is saying that things that were never gluten are like gluten-free. So people will immediately be like, oh, this is healthy for you. Well, like eggs have always been gluten-free as an example, or something ridiculous they put on. They put it on ridiculous things, and you're like, okay, well, this never had gluten to begin with. I guess the last real thing I want to ask you is there anything that we should know? Like, what do you think in this topic? I know it's a big question, but like, what should they know about microbiome, and just whether it's mouth health, gut health? Like, obviously, like avoiding refined sugars, really amazing to know that it has an impact on microbiome, that probiotics, that healthy people don't need to actively seek them out. Doesn't mean that it's adverse to have more, and that probiotics are very specific for specific people, which we'll put up that link for sure. And even also too, that just understand that fiber, whether it's soluble or insoluble, there's so many different fibers within it, are some of my big takeaways. But what are things that people should know as a whole about microbiome?
That was a really nice summary that you just gave, and it hit most of the key notes. As you said, it's a hot field, and we're going to be continued to be bombarded with products and startup companies and research and different things. And I guess it's just one of the things is to just really be mindful of the level of evidence, as we mentioned. If you're deciding something for yourself, are you going to take this probiotic, or are you going to make this change, right? You want to look at the level of evidence. Is it an in vitro study, which means just in a test tube in a lab? Is it an animal study, or is it a randomized human clinical trial that really shows good efficacy? And you also want to take into account who's giving you the message. Even there are peer-reviewed scientific articles, but then if you look at the author affiliations, right, all the authors are affiliated with the company making some product, right? You don't have to be an independent scientist at a university to have a peer-reviewed scientific study.
Yeah.
So you also want to take who's giving you the message, and do they have a conflict of interest? I think those are things to be, things definitely to keep in mind.
I'll tell you a perfect example, ketones. Are you familiar with ketones?
Yep.
So ketones, there's a company that just would not leave me alone. They just wanted to pay me money for content over and over and over again. So finally I told them, like, go away. And one of the things that they had from done research on within their labs, specifically for the point of marketing, was that it was appetite suppressant. So I was talking to them and I was like, okay, so suppress my appetite, how many of these vials do I have to take? And they're like, for your size, the amount of ketones we suggest is 3 vials. And I'm like, okay, so that's basically a package. I think there's 4 in a package, which I don't remember what it costs, but it's somewhere around like $20, $30. And if I was to take that, not only am I spending that amount of money, but also too, I'm ingesting 700 calories for appetite suppressant, which is just, it's absolutely bonkers. Like, how has it even been? It's 700 calories. It's like, what? And like, by the way, I could also just have like 2 cups of berries, which is way less calories and a ton of fiber, and would absolutely slow down my digestion and help me feel satiated. So it was a crazy concept, but their research had been conducted for people that it causes appetite suppression. Dude, I just really want to thank you for your time. Like I said, I always enjoy like you as a person, and I was just so happy to see where you're at in the field. And it's really cool to know somebody, and it's a field that like clearly I'm trying to get somewhat of a grasp on, because it's interrelated enough, but it's such an incredibly complex topic, and that there's such a hot topic right now. Like, dude, I'm really, really happy for you, and thank you for joining me.
Thanks a lot, Jake. Yeah, it was great to see you and catch up, and likewise, man. I'm really happy for you, and I think the stuff, the content you're putting out is fantastic, and is helping a lot of people. So anytime, man. Happy to be a part of it. It was a great pleasure.